Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with the Wise Mothman, a Universes Beyond deck from Fallout. This is a higher power version than the last time we saw the Wise Mothman, and a donation deck from Death Penalties. Thank you for supporting the channel. They have a simple request. They say that the deck needs more resilience as mill attracts a lot of hate. And they say they won't be buying dual lands, budget is pretty open otherwise. Well, I don't think I've ever quite recommended dual lands before, but we'll do everything within budget. As always, I hope everyone's having a wonderful fall. This is a deck I think is really cool. The Wise Mothman's been catching my eye for a while because I really do like +1/+1 counter engines, and recently I was playing like Vishgraz, which I finally took apart. A lot of fun, but I found a little clunky because it didn't have any card advantage built in, whereas the Wise Mothman does in a kind of different way, as milling cards into your graveyard is a way of getting card advantage if you can pull those cards out. But let's get right into that by looking at the Wise Mothman and seeing what they can do for the deck. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is the Wise Mothman and why are they our commander for our Sultai +1/+1 counter mill deck? Well, I would say it's probably because there is no equivalent of a +1/+1 counter mill deck outside of the Wise Mothman, I think at least. The Wise Mothman is a 4 mana Sultai green black blue 3/3 flying insect mutant. They have two abilities. The first one says whenever this creature enters or attacks, each player gets a rad counter, and then whenever one or more non-land cards are milled, put a +1/+1 counter on each up to X target creatures, where X is the number of non-land cards milled this way. So we're going to focus on that second part and we'll take a look at rad counters after. But this is an interesting ability because it's not as straightforward as it seems. It's almost a little more clunky than I'd like, honestly. But it basically specifies that you want non-land cards to be milled, because that's a mechanic with the rad counters. And then you put +1/+1 counters according to the amount of creatures according to the amount of non-land milled. So this is definitely, you could say, quantity over quality, but to an extent you don't want to mill like 30 cards because you tend not to have 30 creatures. So you tend to want to mill in bursts of 5 or 6. Now, the other thing about this is it doesn't specify whether it's your cards or opponent's cards or anything like that, so anyone can be milling 5 to 6 cards a turn or per trigger, and you'll be pretty happy. That also being said, this means that if you use something like one of the crabs, Ruination Crab, that's in the deck, and actually Ruination Crab is a bad example because it mills a small amount. If you use one of those very big, each player like mills 13 cards, let's say, this is probably going to be very much so overkill, because between 13 cards, let's say you get like 35 non-lands, 13 cards per player, right? If you get like 35 non-lands, you just don't have 35 creatures, so a lot of that mill will be going to waste. Now you might say, but Cursed, you're milling out your opponents, isn't that good? I don't know how much I feel about that. Recently I was playing some games on MTG Mutsta against mill decks, and I find mill decks aren't really a problem until they are, and by that I mean like they spend most of the game just kind of hanging out, kind of chipping away at damage, the damage being, you know, your card total. And then maybe if they combo off, or maybe if they get a really good board wipe and some time, they can actually mill players out. But for that first half of the game, you're really helping your opponents by putting cards in their graveyard. So I do like the idea of Wise Mothman as someone you are very, you're very careful about the amount you're milling. Now let's look at the rad counters, which I think is interesting because the token is radiation, but they're rad counters that go on the radiation, but they go on you. This is a bit of a weird thing to me, but I'm not going to think too much about it. So rad counters say at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, if you have any rad counters, mill that many cards. For each non-land card milled this way, you lose 1 life and a rad counter. So this is also interesting. Rad counters themselves I find to be, you know, kind of annoying and soft, like strategy helping, but they're kind of just another mechanic that needs to be in here because this is a Universes Beyond. But I think if Mothman just had like, I don't know, ETB or attack, each opponent mills 3, like just that would have been enough. The rad counter stuff I think is kind of pushing it, but this does mean you can proliferate these rad counters. It does mean because you have +1/+1 counters, proliferation goes further in both ends. This means they do sometimes stick around, but them sticking around is not necessarily what you want. Like, the only way they stick around is if you mill lands, and if you mill lands, it doesn't trigger Mothman. I don't know. I'm talking a lot about Mothman, and I really like the card, but there's a lot to nitpick about its design, which, I don't know. We're living in a Universe Beyond age, so I think we're going to be seeing a lot of weird design in the future. All that aside, looking at this deck, I think it's really, really good. If you wanted to build, I would say like a higher power, because this is Tutors. It doesn't have full fast mana, but it plays cards like Chrome Mox, it plays Carpet of Flowers and cards like that. If you wanted to play just below CEDH, this is a deck you can absolutely build and have a really good time with as it is. I have a few things I want to add to it that I think could help, and I have a few nitpicks, but generally I think it's in a really, really good place. And when it comes to the concept of resilience, well, we're going to get back to that in additions, because resilience comes in a lot of forms. Looking at the deck as is, we'll do our first primary checks of lands and mana curve, but the lands are 32, whereas the mana curve I think is rather good. It stops at 5, 2 is pretty much the highest one. We have very few 0 mana cards, and we don't have that many free spells to kind of make it a little easier. So my first thought is we should be playing at least 1 to 3 more lands, because 32 is still very low. Now, I know this is a deck that runs Chrome Mox, it runs Sol Ring, well, most decks do, but Carpet of Flowers, it runs a bunch of 1 mana dorks to help us with mana. Like, there is a lot of ways to play a game when you only have one or two lands in your opening hand. However, I think this is still definitely an area of contention. I'll note also things like our deck mills us as well, and when we lose a land, it's a lot more meaningful than when our opponents lose a land. We don't have ways to reliably get lands back. Like, outside of, I believe, Evolution Witness, we don't really have much to do that. We don't play Life from the Loam or anything like that. So when our lands are gone, they're pretty much gone. And that can be kind of troublesome. So I do like the idea of hitting like 34, 35 lands. Even if we take out one of the mana dorks for another land, we're playing 99 cards, so we get a free additional card, so that's another land you can just put in right away. So I don't think it's too bad, but it is a concern to me. I think, honestly, I'm a big fan of at least playing, like, especially at the high powers, at least 36 lands. Like, if you don't hit your land drops, you're not playing the game. And your opponents that are playing at the same power level as you, which I hope that's what you're doing, are going to slowly learn this, and when they learn this, they're going to keep you off your mana dorks and your mana rocks. And for certain decks, that's not going to be too difficult. Decks with reliable removal, decks with reliable mass removal will just be able to keep you down for long enough that the Wise Mothman just doesn't come out, and a lot of the deck does not function without your commander. So if you can be kept off mana, if a few counter spells on your commander can make them like you just can't pay the tax anymore, that can be rather difficult. Now, in terms of cuts, this deck is honestly in a really good place generally, so I'm going to be very, very nitpicky about the cards that I cut. I'm going to start with a few of them, such as Priest of Titania. I think Priest of Titania, maybe in your pod there's a dedicated elf player and you're just doing this to really upset them, but Priest of Titania really just does not fit in a deck like this. I'd rather this be just mana ramp, such as, you know, I think we could play like 3 Visits, or any of the others. Even Farseek I think is very, very good here, just to guarantee getting your Triumph on the battlefield or something akin to that, because then it can't die. And Priest of Titania requires quite a few of your creatures to be on the field. Let's see, you have 9 elves. Most of them are 1 mana, but we have a few higher mana elves that I don't really consider to be reliable for Priest of Titania. And I will say that if you have your 1-mana elves out, like Arbor Elf, or the Delighted Halfling, oh no, that's a Halfling, sorry, Arbor Elf, Deathrite Shaman, or Elvish Mystic out, do you really need to ramp further? And do you need to ramp further in green? Because especially like Elvish Mystic only taps for green, and then you play Priest of Titania that only taps for green. And I think that's not going to help you move forward in the game as much as you'd like. So that seems to be a much, like a pretty weak card in my mind. Whereas like something like Sanctum Weaver, I'm a lot happier to include because we're playing 12 enchantments just off that. And of course, Sanctum Weaver, much like Priest of Titania, counts itself. Another card that I just want to nitpick a little bit as well is Ledger Shredder. I know Ledger Shredder is very much so on, let's say, on theme here, because we can put +1/+1 counters on it naturally, and the ability to draw, discard, and loot is really, really nice. However, compared to the other options you could be playing, compared to other things you could be doing, especially at this power level, I feel like it is weaker. I'm not one to just say you should play Orcish Bowmasters, but if you're playing a card that is strong and has +1/+1 synergy just for, you know, for the deck, something like Orcish Bowmasters is way, way better, I think, than something like this. And when it comes to card advantage, I'd rather just have card advantage than looting. Even though we do have graveyard synergy, I think one of the ways we're losing to we need resilience, and we're losing to our opponents, is that we are in a situation where we're just not getting enough cards in hand, and we're spending all of our cards onto the battlefield, and then after a board wipe, after a decisive like attack, or force block, we are losing all of our resources that were on the battlefield, and it's hard for us to rebuild from that. So I'd rather something just more standard of just drawing us cards. I think Dark Confidant is the one I'm going to suggest in my additions, but still worth considering. Going a little further, Winding Constrictor I specifically like here as a doubler because it does trigger on our opponents, like on players. Even though it's just us. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought this was all players. Oh, that would be busted in effect. So that's on me. I should have realized that's not how it works. So yeah, Winding Constrictor is going to double counters on our permanents and on us. So there is synergy with the rad counters because we get double rad counters on ourselves. And there is strategy that synergy that we're getting 2 +1/+1 counters every time. But I don't know if that's still good enough for me. I do like it. I'm not sure if I am suggesting a different doubler, but I think Winding Constrictor does have this thing where I really don't... I don't know. I really like it, but at the same time, it's not helping our deck do what it does any better. It doesn't help in our combos. It doesn't help in any way that something like Thrumming Bird or Vexing Radgull can't like reliably proliferate creatures into like 6s and 7/7s and things like that. And don't get me wrong, it's really, really good with cards such as where's Fathom Mage, which allows us to get double card draw every time a +1/+1 counter comes out. But I would be quick to suggest that these cards are already really, really good in this deck, and this Winding Constrictor is taking the place of probably a stronger card that can work more in your favor than it would otherwise. I don't know. Those are the thoughts I have. It is a very good card, and I think you can trigger it a lot of times, but I think it's kind of win more in a deck like this. Likewise, Edric, Spymaster of Trust, also feels a little strange here. Mainly for the fact that it kind of inverts the problem with these kind of effects. So Edric and these kind of political card draw cards have two sides to them. The first side is much like if you've seen my Brina video, you ignore the political aspect and you use it as a card advantage engine, which I think is why it's here, which I do like. You use it as another copy of Toski, right? Use it to draw a bunch of cards and you're going to be very, very happy. But on the political side, there's this element that you're supposed to have these cards out so your opponents don't attack you and they're incentivized to attack each other. So there's two problems with that. The first problem is in a deck like this, you actually want your opponents to attack you because you have a very big board that's reliable and that grows very quickly, and you have the ability to put out a bunch of bodies and grow them as well. So you don't need protection from being attacked. So if you're not getting the protection, what do you benefit from your opponents attacking each other? Nothing really. Generally, like, maybe there's damage going through, but this also gives your opponents an out to work together and draw enough cards to take you down. If you're very much so in the lead, which I'm going to suggest if you play Edric and you swing, you are now in the lead most of the time because you've probably drawn 5 to 6 cards, and then your opponents want to deal with your board, your hand, anything like that, and they're going to make deals to attack each other with Edric out and take advantage, right? The thing is, unlike Brina, is you don't even get +1/+1 counters or anything off of this. You know, your opponents just get to make deals and fight against you. Now, there's a certain power level where that doesn't really matter. There's this argument that there's no politics in CEDH, for example. I don't know how true that is, but I think it's a really nice idea. But here, you're creating the incentive for your opponents to gang up on you. So, as much as I do really like this card and I think it's very strong, I don't think it belongs in this deck. Going a bit further, we've got the Scurry Oak and Ivy Lane Dennison combo. Now, I'm pretty sure Ivy Lane Dennison could be replaced by other cards, but I think those cards are in white, so I think this is the only way to do it. And this is a card that this is a combo that I think is a little superfluous because we already have the Mind Crank Blood Chief Ascension combo that defeats all your opponents in one go, which I really, really like, whereas the Ivy Lane Denizen and Scurry combo just creates tons and tons of bodies, and one infinitely large creature, which I do like, but I just don't think it has the same power or reliability. I will say I do want you to keep the Scurry Oak, but the Ivy Lane Denizen, this is the creature that says whenever a green creature enters the battlefield, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature for 4 mana as a 2/3, isn't really ideal. Like, it's very clunky outside of the combo, and don't get me wrong, it can get you some triggers on stuff, but it's a lot of mana, and a lot of the times, like, you could say, oh, so I have Ivy Lane Denizen out, I play the Fathom Mage, it comes into play, it's a green creature, I put another +1/+1 counter on Fathom Mage, boom, I've drawn 2 cards. I guess you've drawn 1 card even. Yeah, that's not good. That's not good at all. That's 8 mana for 1 card, and then later, yeah, you could get a lot of advantage, but at that point, I would have rather it just be, you know, a card draw. You know, just I don't know, read the bones at that point would have been better. So, Fathom Mage, not Fathom Mage, Ivy Lane Denizen is cool, but I think it's coming from a power level that this deck no longer is at, and I think we can take that out. Likewise, and this is tough, but our 2 5-mana cards both really don't interest me. Consuming Aberration is a card, for sure. And I think there are some decks that could really take advantage of it. Blue-black Storm decks, even Grixis Storm decks, I think is a cute location where you can like chain spells to mill the majority of your opponent's decks. I think that's cool, but here I don't really like it. I think you don't have the ability to cast many spells in one turn. Notably, as we've mentioned, you're low on land, and even though you have a bunch of low mana spells, you're the kind of deck that wants to cast the best spell it can every turn, which is your higher mana spells. So you're going to be low on casts. So consuming Aberration, either you're holding out to get like 6 or 7 mana, so you can slam this and then cast something, or you're just slamming down the consuming Aberration and waiting a turn cycle, and most likely it's not sticking around, right? So with that in mind, I'm not too keen on this. I think it's very clunky. I think you can do much better. And likewise, I think Herd Bailiff is a really cool card. It is a card I very much so enjoy. I love the idea of creating an army of 4/4s by putting +1/+1 counters over and over again on this creature. But once again, I think this is just too much mana and too much work for this deck. Don't get me wrong, I do appreciate that you can go for an attack, put rad counters, and in a turn cycle get, you know, 3 4/4s. But I think this is too much mana and too much, like, you don't really need 4/4s, you just need bodies. Most likely you won't be growing those 4/4s, but if you have any form of creature, you'll be growing it. So if you had 2/2s, 1/1s, or 0/1s. We'll get back to that. I think you'll be happier. For me, once again, it is the mana cost that holds this back. If you came to me with this deck with a few more lands and like more prepared to cast higher mana spells, I think Herd Bailiff would be a lot better. I recognize that we also have like Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead to reanimate it, but I'd rather just straight up reanimate, or Life and Death that can also reanimate it. I just don't think here in this version it's really, really good. It's once again a card that plays wholly to the board, that loses to a board clear, that doesn't give you any interactability with your opponents, and therefore it's just doing what your deck does already, just more. Looking through sorceries and instants, I love them. Looking through enchantments, I generally love them too. I think we're approaching the point that cards like Psychic Corrosion are too weak for your deck. It's very close. Don't get me wrong, this can still be a very, very good card, because as you keep drawing cards, your opponents will keep milling cards, which trigger more things, and you just keep going. But even then, I don't know if I love this, because you can't combo off and mill all your opponents, right? Because if we go, okay, you have Fathom Mage out, you have Psychic Corrosion, and you have Mothman. So you draw a card for your turn, you mill an opponent. They drop a non-land card, you put a counter on Fathom Mage. You draw a card, you mill that same opponent. So you are getting 2 cards for every card you draw. They mill 2 every time you draw. However, the problem is that you can't mill out all your opponents this way, because you will draw out and lose. And so therefore, this is a really good card advantage card with the combo up, but otherwise it's just kind of a value card, and therein I don't love it. And Sphinx's Tutelage, I think, is better because you can get much higher value if you pick an opponent with low numbers of colors, or an opponent that has 1 color as their primary color, and therefore that draw you got is valued a lot higher than 2 cards usually. Let's say, I don't know, someone can do some math, but probably it's valued at least 3.5 or 4 cards depending on the deck you're hitting. And I think that's good, and that can get you further, but I think it still has the same problem. That being said, with the activated ability on this, I like it a lot more than Psychic Corrosion, and I'm not saying take out Psychic Corrosion, I'm saying think about taking out Psychic Corrosion, because it's on the fence. It's very, very close. Looking in our artifacts, there is just one card I want to note, which is the Ozolith. Or actually not the Ozolith, it's Ozolith the Shattered Spire. This is one of our +1/+1 counter doublers that also can cycle and also can put that first +1/+1 counter onto a creature or an artifact for 1 and a green. So, I don't like this card. I really don't. I think I like this considerably less than the Winding Constrictor, because it's not a creature you can put +1/+1 counters on. And even things like, well, you might say, it at least has cycling. I don't like that. This isn't a deck that wants to cycle this. It's a deck that feels like it has to cycle this, right? And I would rather, like, if we're cycling, why aren't we playing like the Lord of the Rings cycling creatures, right? Like, that's a card that I'm willing to cycle in a deck like this, because that'll at least get us a land guaranteed. Whereas this, if we play it, it just makes our deck kind of win more, and it's clunky, and it's an artifact, so it's the most destroyable type. I don't know. It just feels far weaker than everything else in the deck, and once again, does not solve our problem that this is a card that plays to the board, and our creatures are on the board, so if all of our creatures die, Ozolith does nothing. So those are the things that really stick out to me. Let's go into my additions. Starting with Duskmantle Guildmage. So Duskmantle Guildmage, I think, works really, really interesting because it is a functional copy of our Mindcrank, with that same text that whenever a card is put in an opponent's graveyard from anywhere this turn, that player loses 1 life. That being said, I like this because we can use Agatha's Soul Cauldron on it and put that activated ability onto another creature, so even if Duskmantle Guildmage is milled out, we still have options. But much more importantly, I really do think that having a bit of redundancy in this combo, because the Blood Chief's Ascension is the harder of the 2 to remove, because it's not an artifact, Mindcrank is easier, so having redundancy on the Mindcrank side I really do like. And I will say, there is something to be said about just casting Duskmantle Guildmage and just activating that first ability, because once you do, and then you can do like a very profitable attack or a very profitable mill, it is reasonable to, if you mill your opponents, you know, 8 to 10 cards each, that is quite a bit of damage that you just incidentally do. And I would pay 3 mana. I would pay the 5 mana of casting this card and activating it immediately for that as well. And I think that's an impressive addition. This gives your deck a little bit of reach, because without red, getting those last few points of damage can be difficult. And it gives you something to do with your mill when you're not predominantly using the Mothman plan. So I think straightforwardly, I think this is the best addition. Next, something I really do like is Ripples of Undeath. There's going to be some Modern Horizon 3 cards here that caught my eye that I think you should be playing. This is one of them. Ripples of Undeath mills you 3 at the start of your main phase, which is weird. Once again, not an upkeep trigger, but then you may pay 1 and 3 life, and you put one of those cards from your hand. So there's twofold of why I like this. I like this because it is a constant trigger for your Mothman every turn without you doing anything. But I also like that it is, in essence, pay 1 mana and 3 life to draw a card every turn. And that's a lot stronger than I think people give credit to, especially because you don't have to, it is an option. So you get both benefits here, and I think there's a lot of times that you're going to mill a card that you're pretty happy to put back into your hand and get some advantage out of. It is also like a dorky looking card, and I really like that. The Mind Skinners here, I think this is really interesting. I just wanted to throw this out there. This is definitely probably. This is easier put into weaker versions of Mothman, but I still think there's some value in this for a deck of this quality, because it turns mill into a real strategy for you and not just kind of a side project as you grow your creatures. Don't get me wrong, I do understand this deck can mill at your opponents reliably. I'm going to say semi-reliable, but the Mind Skinner makes it very, very doable, and also empowers the deck by quite a high. Like not only does this mean that your mills on triggers your commander, which triggers, you know, your combat step and allows everything to be stronger. Now those attacks also trigger your commander, which creates this kind of loop where every turn, twice a turn or more, all of your creatures are growing. That's not even added with the fact that now you don't even need to pick targets. You pick the weakest opponent or the opponent that can't block you. You send everything at them, and with the Mind Skinner out, you mill all your opponents for that damage, which I think is very, very good. I wish this was a better card. There's some elements of this card that are rather weak, from the fact that it has 1 toughness to the fact that as a legendary creature, it is you can't have copies, and even if you have copies, the ability does not stack. So there is a limit to the strength of this card, but it is very, very strong, and I think I would definitely try it. This is the kind of doubler that I like, right? It's not literally a doubler, it's like it triples your mill damage through your damage, but once again, this is a card that gives you a payoff for going into mill without needing your commander at all, and I really do like that. Another MH3 card that I really like is Emperor of Bones. I think Emperor of Bones is a nice way to counteract the fact that your opponents are going to be milling some of their best cards. So every combat on your turn, you're going to snipe out one of the cards from your opponent's graveyards to keep it out of their hands. But even then, I really like the fact that with the whole adapt ability on this creature, you're going to be reanimating those creatures. And I think anything from, like, you know, Eternal Witnesses to ETB creatures to, I don't know, even good attackers, you'll be very, very happy to get this kind of card out. And activating it is basically free for your deck, so I think it's very, very good. That's not even including that, once again, it's just a very good 2-mana creature. It puts pressure on your opponents, and I think you're going to be happy to have it out every game. So I think that's another powerful addition. On the less powerful side, but something I really do like, is the Fetid Gargantua. So this one is a 5-mana card. So this to me would be a replacement for Herd Bailiff. Not literally, there's a literal replacement here, but this is a close one. This is more about the mana cost. This says whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on this creature, you may draw 2 cards. If you do, you lose 2 life. Now, it is a May, so don't forget that, but it's important to note that without life gain in your deck, you're going to burn yourself out really fast if you put too much, if you activate this purposely too many times. But in the meantime, this is a card advantage engine that I really, really do like, because it is reliable that in a turn cycle, this will trigger 3 to 4 times. And when it does, you're going to draw, 6 to 8 cards. After that, you're probably good. You don't have to worry about this creature anymore. You can let it die or whatever. But if there's a board wipe after the fact to deal with this, it doesn't matter. You've already drawn your cards, right? Something also worth saying is, unlike your other creatures that require you to like such as the squirrel or such as Edric, like you don't need to get to combat. Yes, it does help because you can trigger other things to put the counters on this, but if you have this out, you have a lot of instant speed ability ways to put +1/+1 counters, whether this could be something as simple as, cracking a fetch for your Ruin Crab, to actually activating Adapt too on this. You are guaranteed to get the cards more often, so you don't have to worry about making things work out. You can even just pass the turn holding up a fetch land for Ruin Crab, and just wait for a rad counter to trigger this. You have a lot of options and a lot of play. And once again, unlike the Herd Bailiff, you are not playing to the board and creating more creatures to be board wipe. You are refilling your hand, which I like a lot more. This is the replacement for Herd Bailiff that I wanted to see. This is Basking Broodscale. This is a card that I think is really disgusting looking, I will say. But I think a lot of people underestimated it for a while, but in Modern and a few other places, this is a card that really, really is interesting because it has a very straightforward version of Herd Bailiff's ability. This is a 2-mana Eldrazi Lizard, 2/2. It has Adapt 1. You can ignore that text. The general thing is whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put onto Basking Broodscale, you may create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature. And what I really like about that is, once again, this is quantity over quality. I like this because this answers the problem that I stated at the beginning of this video, where our boy Wise Mothman has this problem that if you overmill, you don't have enough targets to put counters on. Well, Basking Broodscale says, no, we're good, because it's very easy to create a small army because of when this comes out and how reliable it is to pick as a target every single time to put a 0/1 out. And so when you overpay, you'll just have a bunch of Eldrazi spawn that you can just put counters on. But, and this is the real but, the main thing is the fact that these creatures are mana. And I think this solves a problem your deck has with mana. Now, granted, there's something to say that it's colorless mana, and we do have a lot of colored pips in a deck like this, but this is a very reliable way to pay for example, commander tax, for example, your artifacts, for example, other activated abilities or superfluous mana, like the generic mana costs on things. And I think that's going to be rather meaningful to have that ability. Not even, there is something to say like these cards can be used on a board clear, you can sacrifice it all and use the mana in something. I don't think this deck is very much so built towards that, but that is something you can build towards. Though it's not here, there is Blade of the Blood Chief, which is a 2-card combo once again. Basking Broodscale and Blade of the Blood Chief. Blade of the Blood Chief says that whenever a creature dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on equipped creature. So you equip it to the Broodscale, and then you sacrifice an Eldrazi spawn, which creates an Eldrazi spawn, and you now have an infinite loop that grows Basking Broodscale infinitely large. Now, it doesn't work with doublers, because you might be like, oh, I could put 2 counters, because Basking Broodscale, like many of these other ones, say 1 or more. So there are more difficult ways to make this profitable, as in you make more than 1 token at a time, but also somewhat unnecessary. By doing this, you have infinite colorless mana, and you have an infinite large Basking Broodscale. If you happen to have any form of Blood Artist ability, any form of anything on death triggers, anything that gains stuff when other creatures get +1/+1 counters, you're going to be just making a massive amount of profit on the board, which is really, really good. Also, a very fun card. Coming to the last few cards, Altar of Dementia is one that I also think is notably missing. This is a form of resilience that is maybe not resilience, but it's a backup plan and a proactive plan. So if you are getting board cleared, you can transfer your entire board into mill onto one player, which I think is very relevant in a deck that can generally mill most of your opponent's decks, but may struggle getting the last bits. Being able to take your 30 power on board and mill 30 cards is going to be relevant when they're all going to die anyways. But of course, the proactive version of this is you just do the mill plan until you can just count out how many cards your opponents have and how many cards you have and how much power you have in play. And then once you have that set up, instant speed, you can just mill out all your opponents and win the game that way. Either way, it's incredibly surprising that this deck is not in, this card is not in the deck. And I think this would be definitely one of the top additions for sure. Chart of Course is here alongside Dark Confidant. Both of these cards are just here because I just want you to have card draw, just reliable card draw. A lot of the things you have are either unreliable or requires other cards to work together. So having something like Chart of Course, which is both easy to trigger on your draw, on just getting the draw to by attacking, or if you have one of those reanimate cards in hand, you can just trigger this to discard a creature from your hand to reanimate. But we know you're going to have cards in your graveyard anyways, so generally you just want this for the draw to. I think Chart of Course is a card that's underplayed. 2 mana draw to is just very, very good. If you played Knight's Whisper, you know how good this card is. And Dark Confidant, you know me. I love Dark Confidant. It's a very, very strong card, and I think it is underplayed. If your players aren't playing a lot of ping, if you don't see a lot of Orcish Bowmasters, this gets better. But even then, this is generally a good card. If you can make a turn cycle with it, you will get a card out of it, and after that, every turn your opponents leave it alive is card advantage. I have one more addition. This is a card that's really caught my eye in other formats. This is Overlord of the Balemerc. This works really, really well for a number of reasons. First of all, it is a 2 mana card that gets suspended as an enchantment for 5 turns. What I like about this is a way to play to the board without getting board wiped for the first portion of the game, which is really nice. And then when it's a creature, or you reanimate it into a creature or anything else, it becomes a Titan in the sense that its ability triggers on enter or attack, which is traditionally very, very powerful, a very good combination of cards. If you give it haste, even better. And what it does, and this is the synergy with the deck, is that it enters or attacks mill 4, so it uses the word mill, because a lot of these cards don't necessarily use the word mill, which can be a problem, but this one does say mill 4, and then you may return a non-avatar creature card or planeswalker from graveyard to hand. This is unlike a lot of the other mill cards. It doesn't say like Malevolent Rumble and other cards like this, which once again, I believe Malevolent Rumble is not a mill. It doesn't say that you have to pick from the revealed cards or the milled cards. The Overlord here just says from your graveyard. And usually by midpoint of the game, you have quite a graveyard going. So being able to pick your best creature is really, really nice. Early game, being able to just play this for 2, mill an elf, grab the elf, have 1 extra mana to play the elf to mana ramp the next turn, I think is also just very, very nice. It gives you the redundancy of picking up some cards from your graveyard while deploying a long-term threat. I just really like it. It is a little pricey at the time, at like $10 for a card that one might argue is, oh, look at that art. This is a Pokemon card, 100%. I've been looking at a Pokemon a lot. Maybe that'll be a conversation for another video, but this looks like a Pokemon card to me. But I think it's still worth its cost, and I think you can get a really good deal out of this. I don't know if long-term it's going to match the power level, but I did want to mention it. And that is the deck. Thank you so much, Death Penalties, for sending this to me. I really like it. I think it's really, really strong. I've definitely done some nitpicking, but I hope you understand that's just due to the sheer power level of the deck, and I think it could get even stronger. Please let me know if these comments and criticisms have helped, and please do send me another copy. I hope everyone's doing great, and good luck, and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.